Okay, let's see here.
Welcome, everybody. All right, we're just waiting for people to filter in. All right. All right, let's see. We're just waiting for some of the other presenters to come. Just a moment. Keeping my eye out for them. Thank you, everyone, for joining on our last minute pop-up webinar with a policy update on where things are. Just a second, keeping my eyes out for folks. All right, just a moment, everyone. We're still waiting for the rest of the presenters to join us. Hi, Hugh. Good. All right, let's see here. All right, people are filtering in. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We're just looking for the rest of the panelists here. Give us just a moment. Go. Welcome, Hannah and Hugh. Just waiting for two more here.
Hey, Marta.
All right.
Sorry.
No worries. All right. We're all here. Thank you all so much for helping get our hands around what's happening right now. First of all, to everyone joining us, my name is Marta. I'm the Michigan coordinator for the American Sustainable Business Council. And I pulled this together to try to give an immediate update to everyone on what's happening from a policy perspective at the federal level and at the state level that's really important and relevant to businesses right now. We're in unprecedented times in this pandemic, and we're working hard to find our way in this moment and be of greatest resource to make sure that we can get through this unusual time and get our businesses up and running and successful as soon as possible. So while we are learning a lot about COVID-19, we're also learning a lot about the variety of policy responses that could be put through both as we learn about best practices to handle, get a containment around the disease, but also in our economic recovery. So I have Thomas Opel here, who will first kick us off for a federal update. Things I know are still fluid there, but he'll give us a sense of what's already passed and maybe what's missing from that and what's next. Then Andy Levitt will join us to give an update at the state level about actions that have already been taken and things that might be in the pipeline. We also have Hugh here to help give an understanding on paid sick leave. We thought this was an important issue relevant to our current situation, just to get some updates on the history of where that's been in Michigan and where it could go. And then Hannah from Local First, her whole team has been working to reach out to businesses to better understand the landscape. So she'll give us an update on how some of those interviews are going, and then we'll open it up for questions and or just sharing of concerns or challenges from folks. So first, let me hand it over to Thomas for our federal update. Take it away, Thomas.
Thanks, Marta. It seems like, amazingly enough, things in Washington are moving pretty rapidly, and there's a lot of stuff going on. I will say that just a few minutes ago, well, maybe an hour ago, Senator McConnell, the majority leader in the Senate, was on the floor sounding more conciliatory than he had the day before. Then the Senate Democratic leader was on the floor literally just a few minutes ago, and he may not have even finished speaking, actually. And he described the Senate negotiations, which are right now sort of the center of the next phase. He described those negotiations as having moved from what he thought was the 5-yard line, to use the football analogy, yesterday, to the 2-yard line. Not sure what the sticking points still are, but we seem to be moving closer. Let me, if I can, from that sort of immediate, take a step back. Now, more than 10 days ago, the Congress acted to pass funding, some emergency funding for healthcare. And I won't go into the details of that. It was a first tranche. I'm sure there will be others. Then last week, well, let's see, now it's coming up on a week ago Friday, the House passed. And then last week, the Senate passed and the President signed HR 6201, which was the Family's First Coronavirus Response Act, which I noticed on my slides I misspelled, response. But hope you'll all forgive me for that. Forgot the S, the first S. Anyway, and I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. And I hope I'm doing this correctly. To basically, let's see. No. Okay, I thought I could just share my screen, but I'm not able to. Let me just go through this verbally. Rather than take up more time. So the Family's First Coronavirus Response Act started in the House, passed after some negotiations through both chambers, was signed by the President last Wednesday. And it was really aimed at trying to create immediate attention to leave to achieve what the health professionals are saying we needed to do to stem the tide of the virus. If you think of this as first a health issue, and then secondarily and clearly, 1A, 1B, an economic issue. This first HR 6201 was first intended, aimed at the health portions of it for the most part. The tricky part here is that it didn't cover a lot of people because it mainly covered companies with 500 or fewer employees, and companies of 50 employees or fewer. While they were covered, the idea is the legislation covers those companies, employers of those smallest of small businesses can seek a waiver to opt out of these provisions. But essentially, it provided emergency sick leave for all full-time employees in those dedicated companies of fewer than 500. Full-time employees up to 80 hours of emergency sick leave, all of this related to coronavirus. I'm not going to keep saying that, but obviously there has to be a connection. Part-time employees were also covered up to the average of the hours that they had worked in a 2-week period. There was leave for personal illness would be covered at the full regular wage up to $511 per day. Leave for a family member would be, so in other words, if you're not sick, but you have a family member or a child, or you would get 2/3 of your pay up to a maximum of $200 daily. And this, importantly, this would be over and above whatever the employer's existing policies were. And this law bars the employer from changing those provisions. So if you were a company sick and paid leave provisions, those provisions remain in effect. These would be over and above. So that's for employees of emergency sick leave. For employers, you can qualify for a refundable tax credit against your payroll tax for wages under this provision up to the caps for full or part-time employees. And self-employed individuals can qualify for tax credit equal to 100% of a sick leave equivalent amount for personal interest, or 2/3 for family care provisions. Now that's important because obviously this next round is looking at direct cash. A refundable tax credit is a nice idea in more normal times, but a refundable tax credit doesn't help you if you're the employer right now and you're not getting cash in the door because you don't have customers. Trying to keep your employees covered and paid is an uphill task, obviously. So the tax credit was in this provision. There are other provisions later on that and this third round of legislation that seeks to try and rectify that and make it more direct cash. There's also emergency family and medical leave provisions. Generally, it's 12 weeks of emergency leave under the amended Family and Medical Leave Act. It covers both full and part-time workers. You can have leave to care for a son or a daughter if their school or daycare has been closed or canceled because of the coronavirus. In this case, the first 10 days of that 12-week leave may be unpaid, although the employee can substitute other accrued leave. The leave in this case is 2/3 of regular pay up to $200 a day or $10,000 total. And there is a provision to guarantee employees a return to their job or a job equivalent. Again, for employers, there is a refundable tax credit, again, against the payroll tax for wages covered under this provision. And there is some provision for self-employed. There was a provision for enhanced unemployment insurance in this Families First Act. There was an emergency transfer of $1 billion for grants to states to cover processing for unemployment. There was temporary assistance for states with advances. They could qualify for interest-free loans. There was some technical assistance, extended unemployment compensation. And then finally, there was strengthened food initiatives, additional support for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAPs, student meals, and increased federal support for Medicaid. That's what people now think of as the second round. First round would have been the healthcare. Second round would be the Families First bill. The third round, which is this bill that's now being negotiated in the Senate, largely between Secretary of the Treasury and Senate Democrats. The Republicans put forth their version last week. I think if you think of it, there are really three baskets you can think about, and this is really part of what the negotiations are about. First basket is, again, expanded unemployment insurance with more money to states. Part of the issue there is it going to be grants, or exactly how is this money going to be paid out to the states? What are the states going to have to do to qualify for it? The second grant is clearly of issue to employers, and that's small loans. And I know Andy and others will be addressing this, but part of the issue for the small business loans is whether the loans will be forgivable and under what conditions and for how long. So, for example, there is one provision that is on the table in the Republican version that would permit a loan to be forgivable. In other words, you wouldn't have to pay it back if you kept your employees on the payroll for a specified period of time. And honestly, I forget exactly what the specified period of time is right now, but it was limited to, I believe, only, I think it was no more than 2 months. So if this stretches on, there was some concern about, how that's going to work. And then the third tranche was this stimulus package. Critics would call it a bailout provision of about $500 billion, $500 billion, that would be administered by the Treasury Department. And this is largely aimed at large industrial sectors, airlines, tourism, manufacturing, but more larger corporations. And obviously, there's debate about what conditions might be assigned to that $500 billion. The Republican version put forth essentially left the provisions, the determination, the administration, largely up to the Secretary of the Treasury. The Democratic position has been concerned that that's not enough, and that the stimulus package in 2008, 2009 didn't contain sufficient conditions. So, for example, conditions like what are there any restrictions on executive compensation using the stimulus money? Are there any conditions on whether companies can use the money for stock buybacks? Are there any conditions on labor agreements, et cetera? And I'll close, if I can, with one last thing. The American Sustainable Business Council, joining with the American Independent Businesses Association, we have on our website, which I invite you to go to at asbcouncil.org. We have a petition in which we are asking for certain things to be included in that provision, in that third round and any future rounds of stimulus or coronavirus response. Please go take a look, and we hope you'll join us in supporting our position. Marta, I think hopefully I've probably covered that in too much detail.
No, I think that's great. We've got some questions starting to line up. So in the chat section, definitely go in there and put in your questions or concerns or challenges. We're gonna save the last half of this to dive into some of those. So I see them starting to come in. I just want to let you know we'll be diving in on the later half, but I want to give Andy a chance to pipe in with some updates at the state level, because I think all of this is interconnected and important for the real resources and experiences for businesses in Michigan here. So Andy, take it away, and then we'll circle back for all of the questions at the end.
Good afternoon, folks. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here. I would like to give a shout out to all my panelists who look quite dapper this morning for the webinar. I had a 2.5-year-old who woke up at about 3 a.m., took off all his pajamas in his diaper. So I was a little rough morning for me. So I apologize for not being as spun up as everyone else. But so far in the state has taken a couple of actions that impact business that folks I'm sure are aware of and are looking at. They have expanded UI benefits in 2011. The state curbed back unemployment benefits from 26 to 20 weeks. The governor has expanded those, and she's using the fees and penalties fund to pay for that expansion. It sounds like the federal government will send money to the states to kind of cover those costs and reimburse that. So we anticipate that to continue. And they're working, I think, with employers to ensure that that burden is not being borne by the employer. So that is a piece. If there's questions on that, happy to try and connect folks with the UI department, who has liaisons who are working and asking and managing questions throughout that process. I also have a fact sheet I can send to Marta, who can help distribute it to this group for folks who want to get it to employees who have to have made the difficult decision on laying folks off. It's a fact sheet on how they apply and some frequently asked questions to help with that regard. It's obviously something no one enjoys right now. So I will share that piece. UI will continue to be an evolving issue in the state. I assume at some point the legislature may have to address the UI policy issue. The governor flexed quite a bit of executive authority, expanding it kind of in the moment. It's unlikely anyone would sue her to block it, just given the circumstances, but she is pretty far out as using that action. So I would just flag that as a, at some point, if that issue is challenged, the legislature would have to deal with it from a policy perspective. With federal dollars coming, I don't think they'll feel as much pressure because the feds are covering the costs, so they probably will not be as worried about it. The state government has appropriated $20 million from the Michigan Strategic Fund to support local and small businesses. MEDC's website has info on that. I can share links with Marta, who can also distribute that. Right now, it sounds like the plans for that will be dispersed to local economic development authorities, who will then hook up with local businesses and try and do grant-based support for businesses who are struggling in the current times. Obviously, 20 million is not nearly enough, but it was what they could move at the time. Their most flexible account. Strategic Fund is governed. It's a quasi-government authority, so it's not governed by the legislature. They have their own independent board and can move money a little more quickly. Sorry, pull up my notes. And then I think the other big piece, a lot of small businesses are obviously close to their home communities. We're going to see local governments really struggle with financing their own operations, which obviously trickles down to small business, laying off police and fire, getting back to basic revenues. We're seeing general funds at the municipal level and local community probably taking a hit of, anywhere from 10 to 15% just in these 4 or 5 months between the end of their fiscal year. So it's likely we'll see stabilization funds come out of the federal government into state government. And that's where, hearkening back to the 2009 stimulus package, state government was given flexibility on some of these funds to determine how best to use them in their own state. We don't have text on the Senate bill. We don't know what the House is going to do if they're going to adopt it at the federal level. So when that happens, I think we'll get a better understanding of exactly what the local government play is on that money that's flowing through here. But I anticipate UI for them to play an active role in that, obviously, and MEDC to continue to try and use some of these stability resources to help local economic development authorities, and some of that federal dollars will flow through that. So to date, the state government, most of the action has been taken by the governor via executive order. And most of you have all seen those. If you haven't, she has them well placed at michigan.gov/coronavirus. She has all the executive directives there. And at this point, almost all the executive orders and directives also have a frequently asked question that has been pretty helpful for a lot of clients seeking clarification. Yesterday's executive order on stay home, stay safe has created a lot of questions about what is an essential employee and what is not. And I think we may want to save that conversation for the end, but if folks have those questions, I'll do my best to answer them. I will also drop some directions that the governor's office just sent on helping to determine it. And then we can have a discussion around that. But I think the bulk of the action so far is yet to happen in the states, because we're waiting on the federal action, which will trickle down. And then you've seen the governor's executive orders, which are largely to protect public health, but obviously have a major impact. So happy to help try and solve for any questions regarding the essential employee conversation.
Thank you, Andy. Let's get through the speakers, and thank you everyone for putting in your questions. Keep the questions or concerns or challenges coming in the chat section, and we'll get to them shortly. Hugh, if you want to give just a little bit of background on paid leave, we think it's important because of the nature of this the situation we're in. Obviously, there isn't any active policy that's happening outside of really kind of relief recovery in the immediate, but I think it's a good primer for people just to be aware of or refresh on some of those issues that might come up again after kind of our immediate emergency response period is over. So I'll pass it over.
Yeah, thanks so much, Marta. I would just try to do a quick history of the earned paid sick time issue in Michigan, starting in 2018 and taking us up to what we know now. And I will say, and if there are specific questions about current law or what the ballot measure from 2018 were, we can probably get that to Marta to get out. So just from a historical standpoint, in 2018, paid sick time advocates in Michigan collected enough signatures to put the issue on the November 2018 ballot. In September of that year, the legislature has a constitutional authority to just pass an initiative without it going to the ballot or to the governor. And so in September of 2018, that's exactly what the legislature did. Post-election, in the lame duck period, in December, they amended the law, and which led to the advocates who collected the signatures calling that a gutting of the bill. And so again, we can send out the specifics of the two different versions, but what was passed in December of 2018 and what is current law has significantly less sick time coverage than the original ballot initiative. So into 2019, early in 2019, a state senator, Stephanie Chang, did what's called a request for an attorney general's opinion, whether or not the amending of a ballot initiative in the same legislative session was constitutional. Right after that, the legislature asked for what's called an advisory opinion from the Michigan Supreme Court. So the idea behind that is that the Supreme Court would issue its opinion on the matter before there was any litigation. And so later last year, in October, the Supreme Court basically said that they would not be issuing an opinion. So I guess where that leaves us right now is that the law, that the earned paid sick time law that was passed in December, the second version of that, is the law that's in place. And that leaves right now the options for advocates who there are basically three options that are out there and that I don't know of any action that's been taken on any of these. The first one would be to go back to the Attorney General and ask for an opinion, to file a lawsuit, or to do a new ballot measure, which at this point, with the latest order from the governor, I know that most of the 2020 ballot initiatives have suspended signature gathering and announced that they will not be on the ballot in 2020, and most of them are taking a look at 2022. I know there's still one or two that are out there making decisions, and so those are the options that are out there, and just kind of a brief history on the issue. And as Marta said at the beginning of this, not a lot of action being taken on it at this moment, as all of the other immediate legislation and executive orders are taking place. So
Thanks for the update and background there, Hugh. I think that's valuable to just keep it fresh as we're talking about federal policy for paid leave and how that might weave into state policy. So lastly, and then we have some really great questions coming in, and we'll get to those after Hannah. I think that's a really great segue for us. Hannah and her team at Local First have been reaching out to businesses to get a good lay of the land, and I'm going to do the best job that I can do. I'm sharing her slides just a second on that so that she can give everyone a good snapshot of the conversations she's been having and what people are working with, or what people are dealing with right now. And
yeah, thanks, Marta, and thanks everyone for joining. The team, so Local First is an economic development support organization specifically for local businesses here in West Michigan particularly, but we have been working with partners across the state to collect and disseminate resources for businesses in this challenging time, particularly as our businesses are having to make difficult decisions every day based on a lot of the changing information coming out of the Fed and out of Lansing, thanks to the gentleman before me who sort of unpacked a little bit of that. So on the front lines, my team has been contacting businesses over the course of the last week, just touching base, having listening meetings over the phone, hearing what folks are being challenged with on a daily basis. Marta, if you throw up the next slide real quick. Excellent. So we are asking a number of questions, but the primary questions and the information that we're gathering are, what's on your mind right now? What are your immediate and primary needs? As you can imagine, income and cash flow is number one. Second to that is best practice around human resources, labor laws, how to lay employees off. A lot of our businesses are, so we have started with a list of about 700 businesses that we're doing primary touch points with. So that gives you an idea of sort of our sample size that we're working through right now. But a number of our businesses, probably a good 80% of those, have less than 20 employees. So we're talking very small, often family-owned businesses. And so they're wanting to make sure that if they do have to lay off their people, they're doing so in a way that sets an employee up for what the benefits that they need in order to be safe and take care of their families until they can bring them back onto their staff. So that's going to be a number 2 of our primary needs here. And then 3 is going to be access to current accurate information, as you can imagine. And as the gentleman before me mentioned too, a lot of this information is challenging for anyone to understand, myself included, particularly businesses that are not able to be logged in and constantly updating themselves on what's going on. And so we're trying to gather and disseminate information that's as accurate and action-oriented as possible. So that's SBA funding, that's the loans that are coming online that are currently available. Hopefully those become transferable or forgivable, excuse me, but down the line, but that information is not, that's not accurate just yet. Or I should say that's not confirmed just yet. So trying to give the information that's most relevant right now to our businesses around the executive orders that have been changing on a daily basis, what businesses, to Andy's point, what businesses are essential, who should be out and about, what businesses are available to support currently right now. We also have a large following of consumers who want to support our businesses when they can and how they can. So we're trying to gather that information as well. Marta, if you go to the next slide real quick. So what we have done in addition to doing this outreach, person-to-person outreach, is we've created a crowdsourced document that lives on the Local First website. So if you go to localfirst.com, you can find this, and we'll make sure that it's in the resources that you all get at the end of this presentation as well. But there are kind of two facets to this document. There's the how to support local business as a consumer, and this is being updated constantly with local business resources or I should say local business communications from across our community. As things change and as businesses are needing to innovate at every turn, we are trying to capture all that information so that consumers like us can support if we have the income to do so or the time to do so. And then the other side of this document is resources. We have many businesses that are open sourcing webinars that cover a lot of this content. We have a few law firms, CPA firms, others who have some technical assistance abilities here and are crowdsourcing or are open sourcing all of that for free to anyone interested. And so we're capturing a huge amount of resources through there and sharing them out. We're also working in close communication with other business support organizations like the chambers across the state, the West Michigan Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, a lot of the CDFIs and micro lenders as well that are trying to provide technical assistance, a small business development center. So a lot of our partner organizations, we are open sourcing and sort of collaborating on as much of this as we can to stay updated and also to bring the most relevant and again, action-oriented information to our businesses. And I think the next couple of slides, so this is just some of the information I wanted to have kind of institutionalized in this presentation, because if you go to the next slide, Marta, right now applications are open for SBA loans, and there's some information there's filing requirements. This would be something that if a business owner has a trusted accountant, a lot of this information can be gathered through an accounting firm or from previous taxes to apply. If you go to the next two, so the last two slides here are just the basic SBA, or if they're not here, we'll get them out into the presentation after the fact. But it's a really nice kind of a 2-page infographic of how businesses can navigate the SBA website and start those applications now. If you are challenged, if a business is challenged with gathering those filing requirements or any resources there, they can reach out to us. We, again, are kind of funneling people towards the technical assistance providers that might be able to help with these applications. They are also available in Spanish and I believe other languages as well. So if someone is in need of that, we can help route a business to the right place to find those resources. And we also are, we're working with any local business that might have a little bit of additional capacity to help business owners who aren't currently their clients to help them through this process. So if a business owner is interested in learning more about these opportunities as they exist right now, this would be a good place to start. And then as more accessible financial aid becomes available through the kind of the routes that Thomas, Andy, and Hugh had mentioned, we'll continue to be updating businesses on that as well. I think that's it for me.
Awesome. All right, I want to dive into some of these questions that are coming in. One question that came in, and we will likely be able to just compile some links on this, but does anybody have any immediate information on where to access the waiver application? I think Thomas, that popped in.
Yeah, I would say, and I don't have a specific recommendation. what I would say is that all of those provisions in 6201, and I think a lot of the, upcoming, whatever comes out of the Senate and House as the next round, the Treasury Department will be administering it. So I would start with, go online to Treasury. I'm sure they will have on their website, directions to get to various pieces of what you'll need, be it IRS or other provisions. But I would start in any case, I would start with Treasury, because the Secretary of the Treasury certainly in 6201, and my guess is in whatever comes next, has been given pretty broad authority to sort of determine regulations, set the procedures. So that's where I would start.
Thank you. And I'll dig into to do some specific links for folks as well in the follow-up communications on this, as well as there's a recording of all of this for folks that maybe had to drop off. The other question that popped up is, has there been any change in accessibility and unemployment insurance benefits? Many are trying to access the site but are experiencing difficulty loading pages, etc. Andy, that might be a good question for you.
Yeah, I think this is twofold. A, they are standing up a ton of bandwidth to try and, they went from 3% unemployment to a skyrocketing request. So they had, honestly, UI had reallocated a lot of staff and resources to just not have the muscle memory to intake this many. So they are kind of triaging that issue. If you're an employer who's trying to help your employees navigate that, happy to try and connect you offline. My email is andy@kjlteam.com with UI directly. If you want to try and liaise and help them, or UI does have employees who will work directly with employers to support their employees on ramping as the layoffs start. In 2007 to 2010, they had massive teams that would go right into facilities, and legally they still have those if you have a certain number of employees. So they still have those resources. I'm happy to try and track those down and connect business owners with those if they're trying. I also sent the fact sheet to MARTA, and they are pushing everyone to go online, which is creating, some bandwidth issues. I know DTMB is trying to solve, Department of Technology Management and Budget is trying to solve a lot of their back-end technical problems. I also represent Microsoft, who is working hard with the state trying to solve some of these technical issues and sending them some IT support. So I don't have a great issue, other than I know UI is working very hard to try and solve for it, and I'm happy to try and cut through any clutter for anyone who thinks they can help their employees navigate a difficult issue. So feel free to reach out to me.
Yeah, I think if I want to know if anybody's having specific issues, especially accessing or others, we'll be collecting those and sharing them with partners to be able to try to, if it's a policy solution or if it's just advocacy behind the scenes on a technical issue. I think any ways that we can be helpful to move things forward to be important. I wanted to also, Hannah, do you have any other insights into unemployment insurance, any tips or tricks that you've been finding helpful for some of the businesses you've been working with?
I would really, where I'm finding we are being the most useful is to route folks towards some of those webinars and things on our website that are led by some of our local law firms that are helping to navigate the legality of those items. And if folks, again, I'm also more than happy to, Marta, perhaps you can share out my personal email to folks in the follow-up, but we have a number of those folks who are, those organizations locally who are open sourcing a lot of information. I personally am not an expert, and so I hesitate to offer my personal expertise in those areas because I want our businesses to protect themselves as well as protecting their people. But we do have a lot of teams and businesses out there willing to open source this information, and I'm more than happy to make personal introductions on any of this.
Awesome, thank you. Another question on, does emergency time off apply to full-time employees at the state level that may feel vulnerable to catching the virus? Perhaps, underlying medical conditions or living with somebody with those. And if so, how do those how will reimbursements be handled and by whom? Andy or maybe Thomas?
Real quick, I think I need a point of clarification. Are you, to be clear, are you talking about someone who is employed by the state of Michigan or an employee in the state? I guess I need because employees via the state of Michigan is a little different. I'm trying to see that question in here.
Yeah, it reads like of the state. Yeah, so it reads like it is an employee of the state at the state level.
Mm-hmm. Full-time employees
Yeah,
of the state
good
level that may be.
time.
So the actions the state has taken so far to protect its own employees, they've closed the Secretary of State's office, unless it's appointment only. They've closed basically any intake office that interacts with the public to protect their employees in that regard, and also protect the public from their employees potentially exposing the public to them. So just practicing social distancing that way. They're doing intake on SNAP benefits, which we'll see some federal dollars come in for employees or for employees in this time, all via phone, which is something they had not. For a long time, they had required an in-person interview. It was kind of a hurdle that the legislature had put in place. The governor via executive order has kind of rid that hurdle, and they're intaking online. So that's the way they protected state employees. If state employees are sick, they are ordered to stay home, and they have access to paid sick leave via the state contracts that they've negotiated as state employees. So I think by and large, they are protected. I don't know if they're out of leave, if the state, I'm assuming, is still not requiring the work. The state has not ordered everyone to work from home because, like everyone, they're having IT capacity issues and those things. But in the past week, they've onlined over 10,000 employees to a digital workspace, which had not been done previously, and ordered about that same number of VPNs. So at least that many employees are now qualified to work from home, and are urging anyone who can work from home must. If you don't have the technical capability to do your job, you still have to come in. But other than that, so that's the steps they've taken from the state side that I think try and get to that question.
Another question is, what happens
Hey,
to
Marta,
sick
let
employees?
me
Go ahead.
just, if I can just add to that, just in case this is the direction of the question. One thing I would advise is if you're an employee and your employer has not either taken steps to to furlough you, close down, send you home, what I would do is I would be very careful. Completely understandable that people, particularly people who are potentially in high risk categories, might be afraid to come to work. But if you're in that category and your employer has not yet said, I want you to work remotely, you need to be very, very clear and careful about the steps you take. I think you need to establish a record with your employer saying, look, I need to stay home for the following reasons, and at least establish a record. And on the employer's side, you should do the same thing. You should make sure that you have a record with your employee and make sure you're very clear with your employees what your policies are going to be in terms of working remotely or not, whether that's possible in your business or not. Obviously, if you run a restaurant, that's not possible unless you're doing takeout. But I would just urge both employees and employers to be very careful and to document, what is necessary, because people are going to ask for records later on. So just please be careful. And we all understand it's a very frightening time and a very confusing and uncertain time. Now's the time to be certain about the steps you're taking to try and protect your health.
Another question on paid leave, but for the new FMLA policy, how do we handle it for employees whose jobs allow them to work from home, but they also are taking care of children and homeschooling, or now also daycare providers, which is a real challenge for a lot of folks. Does anybody have some insights on as to how that works?
I would just say again, very quickly, from the in terms of the federal legislation, if you're already working remotely before all of this happened, the issue is going to be then saying if you're then trying to apply for under the 6201, for example, for the emergency leave to provide assistance to a family member, a child or parent or spouse, partner. Again, I think that's going to be you're going to have a tougher case to make because you're already working from home. But what I would say is, again, the most important thing is to document. If you're, for example, following healthcare advice and doing, using telemedicine, for example, document those cases, document any physician's orders that you received, so that you can at least get reimbursed, even if you're working remotely at home. As we all know, we're all getting too familiar with this. If you've got a sick child at home, even if you're supposed to put in 8 hours of remote work, your attention is not going to be the full 8 hours. You're going to be off taking care of your child, as
Right.
at some portion.
But I think the trickiness that people are coming back to is their understanding is if workers have to be home taking care of kids, that they would be eligible for this expansion and sick leave, but not unless it started after April 2nd. Does that date matter?
Yeah, it at least from a federal standpoint, the date is very important because the bill was enacted. In other words, it became law on March 18th. And the provisions specifically said all of these provisions, I'm pretty sure all of the provisions would not take effect until 15 days after enactment, which is April 2nd. So, what to do beforehand? I think the view was that most of the major financial impacts to both employers and employees would be a little bit down the road. We all know that may or may not be the case. But that April 2nd date is critically important from a federal perspective.
And Thomas, I can work with you if you'd like. I can email a couple of federal legislators and see if there's an effort in cleanup. We haven't seen the Senate bill text, so for all we know, this may have been addressed there or in another oncoming bill. Treasury also has wide latitude to interpret some of these things. So I think the intention was to get this help to people. And obviously the hope is that we can be vigilant and make sure that that's the case. If it's a retrospective tax credit, it seems Treasury may have the authority. It doesn't mean they would use it, but I can try and seek an answer and then get that to MARTA specifically on the April 2nd date. And then if we get something clarifying, we'll share with the group as soon as we do.
Great. We're willing to help as well.
Thank you so much. So we have a couple questions on, general expectations on how these grants might work for businesses with the packages that are being proposed, and then also how they might be applicable or not applicable to kind of business and nonprofit hybrid models, and how they might be able to learn what resources they can and can't access for some of those, like social enterprise and those types of models.
I would say, the first place you need to go is SBA, the Small Business Administration. They have the disaster loan page posted, which is a tool you will have to go. It's like applying for any loan. In the Senate bill, I think Thomas might be able to speak to this a little more clearly. My understanding is that there's hope that the final negotiation would be that if you agree to keep your employees on and pay them at a certain rate, I don't know what the rate they'll end up at is, if it's 80 or 90 for 2 months. So continue to pay your employees even if they're not working. You would qualify for a loan, but then it would also be converted to a grant at the end of those 2 months if you met all the qualifications and stipulations. So that would be a direct capital injection that would require you to have retain your employees. Again, we don't have final Senate language, so it's hard to say exactly what that looks like. That's, I think, the perspective the Democrats are taking to try, and one of the issues they're trying to secure in the final package. Thomas, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts in that regard.
Yeah, they, you're exactly right. They're still negotiating it. There was, I think, a significant amount of money that was put in with the idea that as long as you maintained your employees, you could turn that loan into a grant. And I did notice a question in the chat. It did apply to, it was pretty broad in terms of its coverage. So it's small businesses, NGOs, are also potentially covered and could apply under the Republican version, which is the only one we've got text for right now on the Senate side. What they ultimately negotiate, I would think would be potentially a longer period of time, maybe a little bit more money.
And then I would suggest, if you are going to navigate the SBA, I don't know, it looks like, I think it was Allison who asked that question about the resources. Don't sleep on the ability to reach out to your member of Congress and use their constituent relations to help you navigate the SBA. Generally speaking, they can't help you apply, but once you apply, they can contact SBA and say, this is a local business. We would like to have visual on what's going on, and SBA will update them. And it gives you just a bit more accountability on SBA, who sounds like they're not going to do their job, but they're going to be overwhelmed, and having another advocate for you in that process is a great way. And members' offices in their state offices are well resourced to help you navigate that. So if you don't have a relationship with your local congressman's office, I think it's a great time to pick up the phone, introduce yourself as a local business owner, let them know you're thinking about applying the SBA, and see if there's a caseworker you can talk through a little bit about that and make a connection. And then likely you'll be directed to, if you do apply, then let them know. And once they let them know, they will send a letter of inquiry on behalf for you to SBA. And then SBA will be required to keep the office up to date on how the loan is navigating. And members' office are eager to know how the process is working, because if it's not, they need to know that too. So you're doing something for yourself and, kind of the greater good in that regard too. So as a former congressional office employee, I think it's a very underutilized tool. So any of these questions, these staffs are eager and well-resourced to help you. So don't sleep on, just reaching out directly to whoever your member is in your community. And then there was another question about construction projects. It varies place to place. There's something called CISA, the Cyber Infrastructure Security Administration. CISA designates a series of essential employees. By and large, right now in Michigan, if you fall within a CISA essential category, or you are building a construction that supplies or supports CISA essential employees, construction is likely to continue. It also looks like roads fall within that, and wastewater treatment, and all those are still critical infrastructure. So that will continue. The governor's has a little bit of in a frequently asked questions page on this executive order, which is 2020-21, has a question, or has a Q&A about construction, and answers it a little more eloquently than I did. But safe to say quite a bit of construction will still continue, but you need to be thoughtful about how it is positioned within the essential workforce.
There was a question about, has anyone tried reaching out to normal banks for loans to fund payroll leave, advanced PTO while legislation is in process? I'm not sure if Hannah, you've heard of anything like this, or Andy or Thomas, maybe, how that resource or avenue path is working or not working for businesses?
My understanding is that some of this SBA funding may flow through local banks and other local economic drivers. So if you do have a business loan through a bank or a CDFI as a business, any of those micro lenders that might have lent money. What my understanding now is that all of the local financial institutions, so any of those institutions that I mentioned, are focusing on their current portfolios. And then once they have their current portfolios adequately taken care of, and adequately taken care of is subjective, I imagine at this point, but then they will kind of open that up to others. And I think other micro lenders like Grand Rapids Opportunities for Women, I know, and a few others are considering some gap funding, to make gap funding available for businesses who might need a little bit of carryover in between now and when they might actually see an SBA payout. They're doing some exploratory research into this, but I would certainly reach out if you have a current standing loan to your officers and speak to them. And if you have any local banks, credit unions, et cetera, that you've worked with or you're interested in working with, they would at least have insight, and I think they will have dollars available as well in time.
I would just say the expectation is that the next tranche that comes out of the Senate and House is expected to at least have provisions to enable businesses to defer, so that there'll be protection against some protection against loan foreclosures, the ability of businesses to defer payments, for utilities not to shut people off, to assist landlords in allowing tenants to defer lease payments, rent payments, those sorts of things. So, and my assumption, and this is only an assumption, my assumption is that part of the Fed package, part of the Federal Reserve efforts will be to, they're obviously going way out of their way now, taking some pretty extreme measures to pump money back into the economy. And the way they do that is to put money into banks. So to make the banks more likely to say, yeah, okay, we're not going to close you down X, Y, Z. Just because you can't make your loan payment for April and May.
And I think generally speaking, most SBA loans are done with a local lending partner. A lot of your banks and community banks are going to be certified SBA lenders. I'm not an expert in this, so I'll just flag that I assume the disaster loan program will be a little bit different, and the federal government may take on a more administrative role. So I dropped 2 links in the chat there that have some of it. Michigan's already been designated, so you'll have to the entire state of Michigan is designated. The way a disaster loan assistance works is you have to be a declared federal disaster. In Michigan, the entire state is. Only several counties in Indiana have been so far. So if you lived outside of those counties, you wouldn't be eligible. But for Michigan, the entire state is eligible. So direct you to hit that. Second link I just dropped in there. And then, like I said, your congressional offices stand really well positioned to help you navigate some of those questions, and happy to connect you with your right member if you have questions or concerns.
I think the only last question, I don't think we've gotten to it, is information about independent contractors or non-salaried individuals, and how, as related to what kind of assistance can be applied for small business owners, et cetera, for unemployment insurance expansion, paid leave, or FMLA. Any insights into that?
Just quickly from the federal standpoint, you're either covered as a small business, owner, even if you're a single member LLC, you would be eligible then under all of the small business provisions. If you are simply a contractor, part of the gig economy, or just completely self-employed and taking 1099s, there are provisions, at least again in the House bill, or the 6201, that second round, there are provisions in there to provide tax relief for self-employed individuals, which obviously doesn't do anything immediately. Again, my assumption will be that the third round that is being negotiated right now will include some additional direct assistance. And I think part of that is this idea of I think it is extremely likely, as in a virtual certainty, that there will be some direct checks to individuals. So the provision, unclear at this point how much they may be. They've talked about 1,000 or 1,200 or 1,500, various amounts. But I think those direct checks will definitely be included there too.
Which isn't necessarily universal income, as it's been discussed before, but more just a stimulus, direct stimulus to individuals, correct?
Yes, exactly. I think it's what could very well happen is you get a one-time, the provision will be in this bill, a one-time check. I think it's unlikely that they're going to do more than a one-time check at this moment. But if this continues, there has been talk about additional legislation that would provide a second check or a third check or something like that.
One last question that came in, and then we should wrap up here, is is there any insight, Thomas, that if Congress is looking into funding for homeschooling children other than FMLA, since entire school years are being canceled in different states? Ours hasn't quite yet, but it's a possibility. So, some people are able to work from home. It's a resource, but it doesn't address children that are home and how to handle their education.
I'm gonna say I'm happy to do some investigating on that. To my knowledge, I have not heard of anything. And the question is I think one of the questions is going to be, when did you start homeschooling? Was your homeschooling a direct result of the virus? Because the schools were closed? In that case, there are provisions to assist people who are now working from home, not because people were told to work remotely, but because they're having to care for children who are out of school or out of daycare, because the schools or daycares were closed because of the virus. If you're talking about homeschooling prior to this, that's going to be, I would think that's going to be a trickier question.
And I'll just add, so far in Michigan, what we've seen on the education front, schools that can or have capacity to do digital or virtual learning have ramped and extended that. That's obviously not an all-encompassing, and we have real digital divide issues, both in urban and rural communities. The governor's office has convened a work group to try and tackle the distance learning issue as this becomes like it's going to linger further than what folks had hoped. That said, Michigan's fairly unique. Our state superintendent of schools is hired by the State Board of Education, and they are elected via statewide office. So our state superintendent of schools does not report directly to the governor. They report to the state's Board of Education. And our superintendent has interpreted statute to say that current distance learning that is taking place in Michigan does not count as curriculum hours. So students are at home and are learning, but it does not count towards the 180 days they are required to have completed their grade year. So I do anticipate the state legislature having to tackle that statute to amend it to allow this time to count. What that looks like is they could quite simply do a very simple amendment and just say, very rifle shot, that any time during this year period that people were at home because of a pandemic, those hours would count towards school. They could do something more holistic. Sorry, I had a call coming in regarding this issue writ large, and that could come with some funding or it could not. The issue that, funding would tackle some digital divide issues, which the big issue right now that the state is facing is devices. Not every student has a device to learn on, and there is a nationwide shortage of devices. You just simply cannot get them. You have philanthropy all over the United States willing to fund and grant to local school districts to buy devices. They just simply cannot get them. So there's some logistical issues there, and I think that's why you're seeing some states just take the action of terminating the school year. The Detroit Public Schools superintendent advocated in a letter that they do cancel the school year for students, give them credit from this far, and then pick them up where they left off next year. So that'll be an evolving question that may or may not come with resources. The problem is the resources that would come on the device side may not you just might not be able to get devices. So.
Great. All right, I'm going to wrap up. We're a little bit over time. To everyone, thank you so much for joining. I'll be sending out follow-up information, collecting from all of the panelists here, and address specifically the questions, and have another opportunity for people to give additional questions or share challenges in even utilizing these resources, so we can better understand how to continue to advocate and make sure that our businesses are supported during this critical time. So thank you to all, and I send you all my best wishes for continued good health and safety. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.